Good morning, everyone. First off, I'd like to welcome everyone. My name is Elizabeth Caston. I am the Regent of Daniel H. Brush chapter of the National Society, Daughters of the American Revolution. I'm very excited to have Darrel here again. I think this will be about the sixth program he's done since I've been a part of DAR, and every time it's very interesting, something different and something new. So our presentation will be about the abandoned African-American cemeteries. The historian Darrel Dexter has anything to say about it. He has gone through the woods, weeds, thickets, fighting off ticks, heat to find long forgotten cemeteries in Pulaski and Alexander County. His research of countless death certificates, newspapers, notices, courthouse records led to this discovery of the old Lincoln and Salmon Hills cemeteries, whose headstones date back to the 1800s. Through the investigations, Darrel has found over 1,000 unmarked burial sites, uncovering at least 5 United States colored troops from the Civil War. Darrel teaches history at Egyptian Community School and is the author of Bondage in Egypt, Slavery in Southern Illinois, referred to as the most comprehensive account to date of racial slavery in Illinois. So without further ado, I present Mr. Darrel Dexter.
Hey, thank you all for attending. I appreciate lots of friendly faces. I see probably half of you I know. I appreciate you coming. So I'm going to talk today about cemeteries in Pulaski County, Illinois in particular, and I'm talking about African-American cemeteries. And a cemetery, whether it's a Black cemetery or a white cemetery, they tell us quite a bit about the community where the cemetery is located. They tell us things about, for instance, migration patterns, where people came from, where they were going to, where rural schools were located, and I'll explain the connection to that in a minute, as well as rural churches. It tells us about epidemics that swept through an area, and it tells us about the military service of people who are buried there. I was contacted about a year ago by a teacher in Union County Schools who had students that were working on a Illinois History Fair project. And he had kind of sent them on this trek to research a soldier that was buried with a military marker in the cemetery that he had found when he was out hunting as a young man. And well, I won't say how old he is, but he's not necessarily considered a young man anymore. But he had contacted me and asked me if I would be able to provide any more information about this cemetery. And he called the cemetery Whitaker Hill Cemetery. And I said, I've never heard of that cemetery before, but I'd like to visit it. And so he and his wife and we went to the cemetery in his pickup truck and walked through the woods, and he showed me where the cemetery was located. And that's what began my search to try to locate these abandoned cemeteries, especially abandoned cemeteries for African-American settlers in Pulaski County. So what would an African-American cemetery be, and how would a Black cemetery or African-American cemetery be different than a white cemetery? So the answer is pretty obvious, but if people buried in a cemetery are exclusively Black, then it falls under the category of a Black or African-American cemetery. So going through research in death records, atlases, newspapers were a big help. I was able to locate the names of 24 African-American cemeteries in Pulaski County. Of the 24, I was able to find and locate these 12 cemeteries that are located or that are on the screen. And then I know the outline is kind of light, but then even on the map, it shows where they were. I visited all of these cemeteries except for the last two, Bethel Cemetery and Warford Cemetery. So I have the aerial GPS location of those two cemeteries. They're on private land, at least Bethel Cemetery is. So I've got to get permission or want to get permission from the landowner before I try to visit that cemetery. The other cemeteries I consider lost cemeteries. So what I mean by lost cemeteries is I know they existed because they're identified in especially death records and identified in newspaper accounts, obituaries, death notices, things like that. But there's no specific identification of where the cemetery is located. And these are the list of cemeteries, the 12 that I have record, at least from death records and obituaries, of who is buried there, but I don't know where the cemetery is located. And of course, the hope is by presentations such as this one that more people will get interested, get involved, and maybe someone knows where these other cemeteries are located. The first settlers that came into Pulaski County that are of African descent came in as enslaved workers. So the first Black people that migrated to Pulaski County were enslaved. There were 3 settlers from census records that can easily be identified as being slaveholders in the census records. And the first Black people that settled in Pulaski County were not free, but were enslaved. So Pulaski did exist, or I'm sorry, slavery did exist in Pulaski County itself. But more than that, there were hundreds of people who before the Civil War were enslaved, and then after the Civil War migrated into Pulaski County. By the time of the Civil War, pretty much slavery in most forms in Southern Illinois and Pulaski County had disappeared. A couple just examples of mention of slavery in public records in Pulaski County. The one on the left is a typical death certificate, and I don't know how clear that is from where you're sitting, but the death certificate lists the name of the person, and his name is Muke Young. It lists, of course, DK for names of parents. That means not known. And they were born in Tennessee. It lists where he was born, lists his death date. And then one of the questions they asked the informant for the death certificate is occupation. And I think it says he's a farmer. But then there's a place for previous occupation. And when I saw this, it was just so matter of fact, just listed previous occupation. It says slave labor. That was the previous occupation of Muke Young listed on his death certificate. And then in Mobile Cemetery is the marker on the right. Her name is Mary Pate. Notice there's no birth date on the marker. I assume she probably did not know the date of her birth. If you're familiar with Frederick Douglass, a famous abolitionist and orator, before the Civil War and after, he wrote his autobiography, and he didn't know his birth date. And he said most people enslaved don't know their birth date. And so Mary Pate, her family knew she was born in slavery, but they didn't know when she was born. And once again, this is a record here in Pulaski County for slavery. One of the things that I especially wanted to do is look for service in what's called the U.S. colored troops during the Civil War. And a little update from the introduction information, actually, I've been able to add to that list. And I know that there are documented 349 Black men that are buried in Pulaski County that fought in the U.S. colored troops during the Civil War. That's a high number for a small county like Pulaski County. A lot of them are buried at Mound City National Cemetery. So that accounts for part of the large number. So of the people buried at Mound City National Cemetery, 307 markers are labeled USCT, and that stands for United States Colored Troops. During the Civil War, Black men were not, there are some exceptions, but Black men were not allowed to serve in the military until 1863. And then when the service was accepted, it was in segregated units called the U.S. Colored Troops. So in addition to the 307 that are buried at the National Cemetery, there are 42 other men whose service in the U.S. Colored Troops is now well documented. Notice Henderson Cemetery in Pulaski. Henderson Cemetery has the largest number, and Henderson Cemetery has 16 veterans of the USCT buried in that cemetery. In doing the research for this, I also was surprised, and I only learned this about a month or so ago in doing research, but in newspaper accounts, there was a GAR, Grand Army of the Republic post in Pulaski. And I think that accounts for the large number of burials in Henderson Cemetery, which is right outside of Pulaski, Illinois. One of the people buried in the Henderson Cemetery is a man named Jerry Suter. And one of the interesting things, to me, I find it interesting, Jerry Suter was married to an ancestor of Michelle Obama. And so Michelle Obama's family for about 50 years lived in Pulaski County. Not herself, not her immediate family, but generations back. A couple generations back, her great-grandmother was born in Pulaski County and then the family moved to East St. Louis and then eventually to Chicago. These markers, these are military markers, and those that on the previous screens that have the asterisk or the star shape next to their name, those have military markers. And every veteran is entitled to a military marker. That's still the way it is today. Any grave that's not identified or marked by another marker, there, even today, even if it was the Civil War before, even today, their grave can be marked by a military marker that's paid for through the Veterans Administration. So it's made and delivered. I think you do have to pay for setting the marker up, but typically when I have worked in having such markers put up, local funeral home directors or monument people are happy to do that free of charge. So the military markers are all the same. They're all 12 inches high. They're all 10 inches wide and 4 inches thick. And the law says the markers should be of marble or some other, quote, durable stone. So they have to be pretty substantial. They don't all wear the same. So this is a marker from West Side Cemetery in Ullen for Corporal Ephraim Grundy. And his marker, it's difficult to read, and the black, I think it's lichen that grows on it, makes it very difficult to read. I also learned that in national cemeteries or in other cemeteries as well, markers that have the curved slope are for Union soldiers. Markers that come to the point are Confederate markers. So they did make a distinction between Union veterans and Confederate, and that's even at the national cemeteries, that distinction is made. So if you ever visit a national cemetery and wonder why some come to a point and some just have the arc slope like these, it's because of one is a Confederate and one is a Union soldier. Before I go on, also, this is for Alfred Pryor. This is his military record. And I don't know, I know it's hard to read, but if you see at the bottom, under remarks, what that says is slave, SLAVE, slave. This is a marker and another record of military service for Jerry or Jeremiah Curtis. Jeremiah Curtis is buried in Methodist Cemetery outside of Grand Chain. It's called Methodist Cemetery, and all of the old records, death records from the 1800s, newspaper accounts from the 1800s and very early 1900s. Sometime later, the name of the cemetery became known as Ranny Hill Cemetery. And the Ranny family was a white family that I assume probably owned the farm on which the cemetery is located. And the name was lost. It was always called Methodist Cemetery. Then it became Ranny Hill Cemetery. And more recently, I've seen it called Forest View Cemetery. And burials still go on in that cemetery outside of Grand Chain. This is another military record in the middle, and it gives the name of where he was from. This is Jerry Curtis or Jeremiah Curtis, and his marker is not standing, it's toppled over. But under remarks, it gives the name of a man. And then at the bottom, there's an asterisk or a pound sign, and then a note at the bottom. It says supposed to be the name of his master. So it's listed in the military records that he had been enslaved and then enlisted in, and he also, I believe, enlisted at Island Number 10, which was a side of the contraband camps. Here are a couple other records. Marshall A. Jones. I point out that his marker looks a lot different because his family applied for his marker much later. So after World War I and into World War II, when markers were made, and even today, you have the option of putting a religious emblem on the marker. That's how I know that even though it's buried and I can't see the date, I know the date of his death from his death certificate. And I know that he had served in the Civil War in the U.S. colored troops. I have that record, but also I know that this marker is much later. So it was put up much later, probably in the 40s, maybe even in the 50s, could be by one of his children. That's in Lincoln Cemetery. Not all veterans have a military marker. As a matter of fact, if you have another grave marker, technically, you're not supposed to have a military marker with it. Lots of people do anyway, and they use the military marker as a foot marker. I don't complain about that. Whoops. But lots of people do that. This man, Nelson Williams, had a marker, which is also toppled over. It was in Methodist Cemetery. And I know from the screen, it's difficult to read, but inscribed under his date of death is the regiment that he served in the Civil War. And it says Company B, 4th Regiment Volunteer Heavy Artillery. And when I go back and look at his military service records, it shows that it was in the heavy artillery of the U.S. colored troops. And he's buried in Methodist Cemetery, as is Jerry Curtis, who had a military marker. So African Americans had lived in Pulaski County for many decades before the county was ever created. It was made in 1843. A man named Moyers provided most of the research for a county history that was published in 1943 as a 100-year anniversary, the history of Pulaski County. And this is what the county history says. It says, after the Civil War, Blacks came to Pulaski County in great numbers. Some of the men had served in the Union Army and came to the North for safety's sake. Others heard of opportunities which had been denied and came. So if you look at the chart, which is a population graph, the total population is the longer one, and then the smaller kind of orange, brownish color is the Black or African American population. So notice it's insignificant in numbers anyway before 1865. And then after the Civil War, 65, 70, on and on, each decade, it increased substantially. One researcher did work on Black citizens of Pulaski County and published an article in the Illinois State Historical Journal several years ago. And she said, looking at this and comparing it to other places in the rural North, that Pulaski County had the largest African American population by proportion of anywhere else in the United States in the rural North. So the point is, the African American presence in the population of Pulaski County is more significant than many other counties in Southern Illinois. Typically, the Black population, and this is also reflected in the last census, 1/3 of the population of the county. This photograph, courtesy of Mr. Palmer, this is a photograph of a rural school in Pulaski County. And in 1874, Illinois passed a law that said white children and Black children had to be admitted into the public school system. What that meant was that school districts then had a choice. They could create an integrated school for Black students and white students, which is what you see reflected in the photograph at the Hoffner Schoolhouse, or they could create separate school systems, a Black school and a white school. It was up to the school board and the taxpayers of that school district what they wanted. Hoffner School, which is where close to Pea Ridge Cemetery, which is an African American cemetery in Pulaski County in the Perts-Weetog area. It's pretty much known as Pea Ridge, although officially in records, it's also called Mount Olive Cemetery. But the Weetog correspondent in 1893, he was writing about the events of Weetog, and this is what he said for the Cairo Evening Citizen. He said, the white pupils of the Hoffner School got their backs up last week and refused to drink from the bucket from which the colored pupils drank. The teacher procured another bucket for them, and now the Negro children are raising a row, assisted by their parents, and are howling about Negro equality and threatening all manner of calamity if forced to drink from the same bucket. The civil rights movement didn't start in the 1950s and 60s in the South. The civil rights movement, the fight for equality, started much earlier than that. And then the writer added this note, kind of a negative note, I think, from my perspective. He said, all this proves the old saying that oil and water won't mix. We know about separate drinking fountains. Who would have thought separate water buckets? The following week, though, the correspondent had this to say, which offers, I think, a little bit of hope. He says the pupils of Hofner School have all agreed to bury the hatchet, and they are all drinking from the same water bucket. Go figure. Oftentimes, cemeteries were started next to rural schools, and then also oftentimes they were started next to rural or country churches, Black churches and white churches. Same scenario, the same basic story. Where there was a church in the country, there was likely going to be a cemetery. This is the bell from New Bethel Missionary Baptist Church. It was organized in 1880, and this is the original bell. That church still exists on Lufkin Road outside of Mounds. And of these church cemeteries or cemeteries that were started next to a church, only Bethel is still an active church. Most, and this is true of white churches and Black churches in rural areas, they tend, because it's pretty much from 1900 each decade, there's the depopulation of the rural Southern Illinois. People leave the area. As people leave the country and as people on rural farms have fewer and fewer children, country churches tend to close their doors, whether they're a Black church or a white church. I took this picture of Mount Zion Church in 1984. And this is the first Black cemetery that I transcribed or recorded the markings on the stones. I did that in 1984, and luckily I took a picture of the church. Being a little bit, I guess, on the nosy side, I peeked through the windows and went in the church. Probably not that safe, but I went in. There weren't any pews, but the pulpit for the church was still there. The pews were gone. And when I went back about a month ago to the cemetery, the church is gone. Probably for safety reasons, it had to be demolished. But in its place, the brick foundation of the church was still there. And in its place, which wasn't there in 1984, was this marker. And the marker, I know, is difficult to read. Actually, if you stand in front of it, it's a bit difficult to read. But it says, "This memorial honors the Negro farmers and day laborers that founded the community of Mount Zion in the mid-1800s. These settlers consisted of Dotson, Wilson, Butler, Edmonds, Reed, and Pearson families. Some were freed slaves, some were freed men, contraband from the Civil War era. The Mount Zion Cemetery and the initial foundation of the Mount Zion Free Will Baptist Church, established in 1891, is west of this memorial," which is, we're facing west. When I took the picture, I was facing west. The first church board of trustees, John Butler, Albert Dotson, and John Reed. That was interesting. And then at the bottom, there was a quote from John Butler. John Butler was born in 1842 into slavery and then died in 1912. He's buried in the Mount Zion Cemetery. And the quote is this: "If you want politics, go north. If you want to make money, go south." I'm not sure what he meant by that, but it's interesting to kind of ponder or think about. Was it from a perspective of the Ullen Olmsted area, talking about north and south, or I don't know, but it was interesting. Another thing that I found kind of interesting, I'd never heard of before, was in two cemeteries in Pulaski County, they were started by burial associations. And a burial association is a benevolent or charitable society. When you become a member, you pay dues, and then when you die, they provide you with a place to be buried and a marker. And these are markers, they haven't withstood the test of time very well. I'm not sure what kind of stone they were made of, but these are markers that mention that they were members of the Alexander County Burial Association. And the cemetery is right on the Cache River. And a matter of fact, from facing that cemetery or that marker to my back was the Cache River at not a far distance. It's in Alexander County, but the Cache River is what separates Alexander and Pulaski County. So it's very close to Pulaski County. The cemetery is called the Alexander County Burial Association Cemetery, or the Goodwill Church Relief Society Cemetery. Another one which I have not been able to locate is somewhere around Mounds, Illinois, in Pulaski County. It also is a burial association. It's called the Church Goodwill Cemetery. It's not the same as this one. And I haven't been able to locate the one in the Mounds area. So there are close to 3,000 burials now in African American cemeteries that have been documented. And then just across, like the one I just mentioned, just across Cache River in Alexander County, there are about 250, actually 246 additional burials in 2 African American cemeteries that are just across the river in Alexander County. These do not include burials in segregated cemeteries. So in Pulaski County, there are cemeteries in which Black people and white people are buried together. Those are usually segregated, not today, unless by tradition, but it's the same cemetery that has Black people and white people buried together. Beechwood Cemetery, Beech Grove Cemetery, those are examples. Cairo City Cemetery, which is actually in Villa Ridge. That's also a cemetery for Black people and white people, but it's segregated within the cemetery itself. 91 burials are in Black cemeteries that I've not been able to locate. So these are what I call the lost cemeteries in Pulaski County. Matter of fact, of the 24 cemeteries I have found documentation for, 5 of them are maintained. They're mowed, they're taken care of. 7 of them I would call abandoned cemeteries. Those are the ones that are off in the woods. Those are the ones that still exist, that can be visited, but they're not maintained. They're not cared for. And in some ways, people might argue they're better preserved because nobody goes there. But at the same time, the people that are buried there are among the forgotten. If you can't visit the grave or don't know the grave exists, then the people are forgotten. And then to add to that number, there are the 12 that I just don't know where they're at. Those are currently also lost. So real quickly, I just want to go through a few of these cemeteries and show you photographs of what they look like. This is called Pea Ridge Cemetery, or more officially, I think Mount Olive Cemetery. A descendant of people buried there has taken it, as I understand, upon himself to clear the cemetery and cover the expense of putting a fence around the cemetery. So the cemetery is mowed. It was last year. And even at that, and this is true of all cemeteries, if you've ever gone to a country cemetery or a rural cemetery, you're going to find markers like the one on the right that have been toppled over, maybe by a deer, maybe vandalized, but once they're toppled over, they're broken. So the neglect is obvious. Even when we start working to preserve the cemeteries and get them back in shape. The years of neglect are still there. Cemeteries are often just knocked over, or the markers are often knocked over. Sometimes when they're knocked over, they get broken, like another one at the top. And then the markers are still legible. You can still read them. They still mark the side of the grave, of course, but they're not erect. They're not standing. Probably the biggest surprise to me in doing this research was finding Lincoln Cemetery. And this was one of the biggest surprises because I found documentation for over 1,200 people buried in Lincoln Cemetery. Of that 1,200, there are very few markers. Most people buried there are buried in unmarked graves. There are no markers. I think people could be buried there at no expense. So maybe many of these people couldn't afford markers. Another thing I found in that cemetery, Lincoln Cemetery, was the foundation. I don't know what that building was, if it was a church, if so, it was a small one. But this cemetery, Lincoln Cemetery, is just outside of Mounds, Illinois. Now it's in the woods. It's probably the best example of what an abandoned cemetery looks like. Many times I get calls from people. I was out hunting and I found a cemetery in the woods. Do you know about this cemetery? So a lot of times hunters are the ones out walking, or hikers out walking, that come across the cemetery, such as this one. But as you can see from the photographs, it's definitely forgotten, left to the woods. Union Grove Cemetery outside of Ullen is also one of the early cemeteries I visited. The marker on the right is for a woman named Caroline Gardner. And Caroline Gardner was born into slavery in 1827. And then the marker on the right was for Mary Ella Posey Gardner. It says she was born, of course, after slavery had ended. She was born April 23rd, 1866. She married in April 1883 and then died the following year in August 1884. Her husband is the son of Caroline on the left, and he's pictured in the middle. His name is Samuel Patrick Gardner. He was born, he wrote his autobiography. He was a teacher and a principal at the Ullen Segregated School, sometimes called the West Side School. He was a teacher in Mounds. He was a teacher at Sandusky, all in segregated schools. But he wrote his autobiography when he became older. And he said in there that he was born in 1857 in Weakley County, Tennessee. And then at the age of 4, he recalled very clearly being put on the auction block and being sold away from his mother when he was 4 years old. They did reunite, the family did reunite after the Civil War. They came to Mounds, Illinois area in 1870. And he taught school in the different places that I had mentioned. And then his autobiography kind of took the title a little bit from Booker T. Washington, but it's called Up From Slavery, which is the same title Booker T. Washington gave his autobiography. But Samuel Patrick Gardner added 50 years a teacher in the schools of Southern Illinois. And his autobiography, I have a photocopy of it. I know that in the SIU archives, there's a photocopy that I've shared with them. They have it there. It was printed by a newspaper printer in Vienna, Illinois. And for some reason, a copy made it to a university in Indiana, and they had it in their special collections. And that's the only, as far as I know, the only copy of Mr. Gardner's autobiography. Yes. Oh, personally or Union County? That's good. Yeah. Now we know there are two. So, and maybe there are others, but that's interesting. Solomon Hill Cemetery. This is the photograph. This is the one I'd mentioned the teacher at the beginning. This is the cemetery he took me to. He knew it as Whitaker Hill Cemetery. It's actually Solomon Hill Cemetery. And there are close to 200 burials in the cemetery, but there are only 14 markers. So I was amazed. Same thing in Lincoln Cemetery, the difference between the number of marked burials and then the number of actual burials. But a 1927 newspaper, the Pulaski Enterprise, said this, which kind of helped solve that mystery a little bit. It says about 1 acre of a Negro cemetery near Hodges Park has sunk to a depth of 12 feet, leaving the coffins, the bodies, and the skeletons exposed. It was discovered the bottom apparently had dropped out of the cemetery last week. The exposed dead make a health menace. Ed Lathan went to Cairo to report the strange finding to the county board and asked for help in taking care of the problem caused by the sunken cemetery. Some think the high water has had something to do with it. And then the following week, because it's a weekly newspaper, the newspaper said the bodies that were buried in the colored cemetery near Hodges Park and which became exposed when a portion of the ground slid from the hillside, leaving many skeletons uncovered, have all been buried again. The bodies had been left exposed for more than a week and were becoming a serious menace. The county stood the expense of the second burial. The cemetery is situated on a hillside, and the constant rains for the past several months have saturated the ground and caused the slide. So it was basically a mudslide. When you think of mudslides, I typically think of California, but there can be mudslides here as well. Bethlehem Cemetery in the Olmsted area is also one that's partially relegated to the woods. About half of it has been cleared and is maintained and mowed. This is the marker for Muke Young. So remember at the beginning of the presentation, I showed you the death certificate. I think his descendants have put up this granite marker, but it shows he was born in 1832 and died in 1911. And then behind his, in the wooded area, there are these markers, which is really the oldest section of the cemetery. You can't see it, but there's spray paint on the marker at the left. There's that dot at the top is spray paint. And because it's in the woods, someone has taken paint to, I guess, identify the trees to be cut, and got a little carried away with their paint. And there are several markers that were sprayed with that spray paint. This was surprising to me. This is Mound City National Cemetery. I didn't know that a national cemetery would be segregated, but apparently most cemeteries were segregated. In the beginning, I know because I've walked, and many of you probably have, the National Cemetery. In the beginning, when soldiers died during the Civil War, it wasn't segregated. Black men and white men were buried beside each other in the same section of the cemetery. But beginning, I think, about early 1900s, especially into the 20s and 30s, things changed. And the National Cemetery, this is called the colored troop section. You walk the cemetery and all of those rows, row after row, all of them are labeled USCT, United States Colored Troops. Obviously, the cemetery was segregated, even here in the north in Mound City, Illinois. 1948, President Harry S. Truman signed an executive order integrating the military. And from 1948 on, the military has been integrated. And one consequence of that executive order, national cemeteries from that point on, burials from 1948 on were integrated. They're not segregated. Okay, in conclusion, I'd just like to kind of put all of this in context or perspective. So obviously, African-American cemeteries are significant to people of African descent. It makes sense, they would be, especially people descendant or who have a connection to Pulaski County. These cemeteries would be of greater importance. But this presentation wasn't just for people of African descent. This is American history. This isn't just African-American history. This is American history. And it does especially focus on people of African descent, but the history is our history. So this is history that's for all of us. There shouldn't be a separate African-American history and a white history or European-American history. There's American history. And so this is really, in my opinion, the story of all of us who have a connection to Pulaski County, whether you have African ancestry or not. And this is something because you can see how this has been kind of over the decades. Cemeteries have been abandoned. This is something we need to strive. If we can't maintain the cemeteries, we need to at least preserve a knowledge of their existence. And that's what my research and my presentation has been about today. I do want to thank you again for attending. And I understand Peggy has a microphone back there. If you have questions, I'll do my best to answer those questions.
Yes, I'd like to know if any apparatus was used to find the tombstones that's under about 4 to 6 inches of leaves.
Right. I have not done that. I know I've helped the Shawnee National Forest archaeologist. She has identified some cemeteries on National Forest land, and she has metal prods, and you can locate buried markers. I haven't done that myself. So, and I do know there may be other markers that are buried, likely are, but that hasn't been done by me anyway.
Well, the Madison County group did a rural cemetery, and we got there and there were either 8 or 12 markers.
Wow.
When we left, there were over 60 that
Exactly.
we found.
Yeah.
And the ones under those leaves are in perfect condition.
I've noticed that cemetery markers that toppled over face down are much better preserved than those that toppled over face up.
Thank you.
And I think that that's a good project to locate those. And maybe many of those graves were marked and just the marker is buried. Yes.
Several stones, maybe 8% more than we knew of. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So he said he's found at Old Shiloh Cemetery, which is another rural cemetery in Pulaski County. How many extra? You said 8% more than what you had?
8 or 12
Yeah.
more over 100.
Yeah. So there's more work to be done. Let's put it that way.
We also witched some of them.
Witch, yeah. I'm not a believer in the witching, but those of you that don't know what the witching is, I have seen it work. I can't explain why it works, but if you have a metal bars, like welding, and then you hold them and walk over a grave, it's supposed to cross one way for male, right? And another way for female. I've seen it work. I've seen people do it, but I'm still not convinced. My scientific mind won't let me accept it by faith.
Yes, Darrell, I was wondering, how do you go from, in your research, from the finding the death certificate to connecting that with the gravestone, or do you do it the other way around? You find
Yeah.
the gravestone and then you
Yeah.
know.
I've done it both ways, and I have gone to the courthouse, and this is also a clear sign there's more research to be done. I have only looked at the death certificates in Pulaski and Alexander counties through 1926. So there's a lot more, no doubt, to be identified, but on the death certificate, it will state the name of the cemetery. And if it's filled out completely, it'll state the location of the cemetery. Usually it's the closest town, but at least it gives me an area of where it's located. From there, I can start asking questions. You know, does anybody know where this cemetery is? You know, you've lived here for 50 years. Have you ever heard of a cemetery in the area? I know for Lincoln Cemetery, outside of Mounds, I ask everybody, do you know where Lincoln Cemetery is? No, I've never heard of Lincoln Cemetery. Actually, the cemetery is huge and it goes up almost to the railroad. The Catholic cemetery from there, just keep going towards Mounds before you take the turn. Take the next turn to the left and stay on that road. I think it's called the Old Villa Ridge Road, and just stay on that road for a few miles and you go right by the cemetery. This time of year, if you look for it, you can see some of the graves standing up. Give it a month or two and you won't be able to see them, but that's the road that it's on. And it's very close to the railroad.
Two questions. Is there a story behind these stones? And secondly, on the front page of your presentation today, was that a milkweed? And if so, what species?
On the beginning presentation, that was a bud from a pine tree. Yeah, that was a pine tree.
It's beautiful.
Yep. And I don't know for sure the story, but these are 4 children of a family that died. And I was surprised because of how elaborate they are, that they haven't been broken. It just seems they look more fragile to me, but those 4 markers are there for 4 children that died. And this, under the tree, I believe that's the tree where Mary Pate is buried. Remember the marker I showed at the beginning where it said born in slavery? That's the same cemetery. What cemetery is that one? That's Mobile Cemetery.
Hey, you ever see any images on those headstones?
Images as in
Faces,
faces?
bodies, images. Yeah,
I don't see them. No.
we do. I do.
You did?
I do all the time, but she saw some too. They're on there.
I I have to take you, you'll have to take me to a cemetery and show me. I've looked at them. That would take even more faith maybe than the witching, but yeah, not judging, but okay. Any other questions?
I have some questions from Zoom. Actually, we have a really fun and rowdy conversation going on in there. We have from Faith Miller. I think you answered this about if there has been any movement to make these historical landmarks more preserved. We have a similar question as to what grants may be available and what funding may be available, what organizations may be able to assist with preserving these cemeteries.
The first question was, is there a movement to preserve them? Not that I'm a part of or know about, put it that way, other than the fact that I'm making presentations, trying to inform people about them. As far as is there grant money, those of you, and I recognize a lot of people in historical societies and genealogical societies, I'm not saying the money's not there, but it's very difficult to get grants for that type of thing. So there may be grants available, you know, to do the research, but as far as actual preservation of the stones, you know, what has been done, and there's been some work done, have been done by family members, I assume descendants, rather than through any kind of grant money from the government or state. So it's all been done through the private sector rather than through grant money. It would be great. Seems like in the 1970s, they were giving away money all the time, and that's just, it doesn't happen that way anymore. But if anyone knows of grants, for sure, I would be interested. My email is on the screen. It's darreldexter@hotmail.com. So if you have suggestions or ideas about that, please.
Pulaski County refused to enforce it. They didn't want to take care of
Right.
colored cemeteries. That's what I was told 50 years ago. But Union County has used it.
Well, Union County used to maintain rural cemeteries, but I think they don't do that anymore.
But there
There used to be a tax that was collected, and then the highway department would mow these cemeteries when they were identified. That's in Union County, but I don't think they've done that for the last several years. So, right. And hopefully if they don't have enough money to do that, hopefully they're not still collecting the tax. That's what I would hope. But you think they are? Yeah. Yes.
Yes. We have some more questions for you here. Denise wants to know if there is any chance that you will be furthering your research into other counties.
I mean, there's always a possibility, but there's so much to be done in Pulaski County in this area and Alexander County. I'm sure in other counties, there are probably other people doing this type of research, but I don't have any plans to expand it beyond what I'm doing here or there in Pulaski County and also Alexander County. Many people that are buried in Pulaski County are actually from Alexander County. And Cairo, as large of a town as it was, 20,000 plus or close to it at one time, there's no cemetery in Cairo. The Cairo City Cemetery is in Pulaski County. So many people from Cairo and Alexander County are actually buried in Pulaski County. But that's pretty much where I've limited this research, and at least at this time. But there may be other people doing it in other counties.
And if there is anybody here in the audience at the library or on Zoom or watching on Facebook or YouTube, you can see in the slideshow here, Darrel's email if you'd like to get in touch and work on research together. I think I'm going to cut it off there in terms of questions. We have a lot of really interesting comments and people that want to reach out to you. So look out, Darrel, for a long email from me. It will also be me reaching out to you for research as well. So
I do want to say the research that I've collected, I did bring that. I do have a printout of it. If anyone is interested in looking for family members or cemeteries, you're welcome to flip through the book after the program. Again, I thank you very much for attending. I've enjoyed it. I hope you've enjoyed it. And thank you again.
Thank you all. For members of DAR, we will be holding a short business meeting in the room up here. If we can get up there and get that taken care of, and we'll get you out of here fairly early. And then, yeah. Oh, is it, where are we going? I don't remember. Bandanas for lunch after we're finished. Thank you.